Jacob, we've asked you to join us because the biggest domestic story of the week is that of Axel Rudakubana, who rather unexpectedly, actually, on the day one of his trial, pleaded guilty to the murder of 3 young girls at a dance class in Southport last summer and the attempted murder of 8 more children and 2 adults. And that plea meant that lots of new information about Rudakubana then flooded into the public domain. He had been referred to Prevent, the government's scheme to stop terrorist violence, 3 times, we were told, in 5 years before the attack, for showing an unhealthy obsession with violence. The first time, in 2019, was when he was just 13 years old. We also learned that Rudakubana had contact with a whole raft of other organisations too, the police, NHS mental health services and social services. And so the government has now announced a new public inquiry into these failings as well as a range of other measures. Jacob, let's start with you. Keir Starmer has said this week that terrorism has changed and Britain faces a new threat from loners, misfits, young men in their bedrooms accessing material online. Is the threat new?
No, I don't think so. For those of us who've been monitoring terrorist movements, extremist movements, and indeed those broader movements which endorse violence, this is a trend which we've picked up on for a number of years now. The threat of violence to public security is something which is constantly changing, constantly evolving with the way we communicate, the social media platforms which young people are plugged in on. Whereas sort of 10 years ago, it might have been more characterised by affiliation to a movement, Al-Qaeda, but Islamic State. It's become a lot more diffuse and oftentimes a lot more ambiguous. So this isn't something which necessarily surprised us, although, of course, this is perhaps the most violent manifestation of this type of activity in recent memory in the UK. I would sort of challenge the idea that what happened here is a terrorist threat, though. So we understand terrorism to be violence which is inspired by an ideological, political or religious motivation. What we're seeing here is something a little different, right? There are the growth of these communities online which endorse violence for violence sake, which glamorise, which fetishise mass killings. And I think that this is actually the important piece here when we're talking about where gaps might exist, where there might be failings in current policies.
But when you say you'd question whether it's terrorism, is that because our current terrorism laws don't capture this kind of crime, this kind of motivation, as Keir Starmer talked about this week? Or is it just you don't think it's appropriate to call it terrorism?
Well, yeah,
because I mean, when you take a step back and you look at what Axel Rudakubana did, targeting a class of young girls, it must have been terrifying and terrorising.
Of course. I can see where you're coming from here, right? This might seem like quite a technical, quite an academic distinction to make. Ultimately, 3 young girls were murdered. And to a lot of your listeners, they might be saying, well, what is the difference? But I think it's an important distinction to make, both practically and in terms of government policy. On the one hand, I don't think necessarily that broadening the definition of terrorism in ever-expanding ways is particularly helpful. When we think about the Prevent programme, that's one pillar of the government's contest counter-terrorism strategy. That is about ideological disengagement. How do you disengage people when there's no ideology? So if you're broadening this, you also need to broaden the tools and the resources available. I think there is also the risk here of mission creep of counterterrorism. Instead, what I would be saying is actually we should be considering whether or not there need to be broader parallel structures in place, which converse with the Prevent strategy, but which can help prevent mass violence like this.
It's worth pointing out that the referrals to Prevent have been creeping up, haven't they, of this, they call it, it's individuals with a vulnerability for radicalisation present, but no ideology or counter-terror risk. And I think the latest figures up to the end of March 2024, well, this was over a third of referrals to Prevent, 36%.
Exactly. And I think sort of to help contextualise this, it's important to think about Prevent as a live strategy. It was set up following the 7/7 bombings when the primary threat was from organised Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda. It's evolved. It's now incorporating these much more diffuse white supremacist movements, which are inspired internationally, but not by particular groups or individuals. And yes, as you've said, we've seen sort of the bolting on of additional categories. This is what used to be, or what's sort of used to be framed as mixed, unclear, or unstable. Now, to me, this seems like a bucket where you put people who are referred to Prevent, where you don't really know where else to place them. But that's just the referrals. There are other stats which are published by the Home Office. So there's a mechanism within Prevent called Channel, right? This is the programme for ideological disengagement. There's this really large bracket, as you say, the largest bracket, 36% of referrals fall into this no ideological category, but they're one of the smallest groups which actually then get referred into that channel programme for ideological disengagement. Instead, people are signposted, again, I would question what that means, into other services. So the fact that there's this big gap, which on the face of it, we don't really know what to do, suggests that the strategy needs to be adapted.
Yeah. Andrew, politically, it was noticeable, I thought, that Keir Starmer came out very quickly on this compared to other issues that the government have faced over the last 6 months or so. I mean, did he have to respond in this way?
Yes, he did. And I think, I'm not the only person who has wished Keir Starmer to be more forceful and clearer and, in a sense, angrier about the positions he's taking. He came out as soon as he could in terms of the legal process and the trial. And he was answering really what has been the big right-wing conspiracy theory all the way through this, which is that this killer was part of an Islamist network. He was a recent migrant, and we are surrounded by the Islamist threat. And frankly, we must deport far more people, which is what the right wanted him to say. And because he doesn't believe it, he wouldn't say it. So what he was saying instead was he was explaining why releasing more information, as his opponents have been calling for earlier in the process, might have collapsed the process and allowed this appalling person to get away free. And there was a real edge of anger and personal affront in what he was saying, which I thought was quite effective when he took on questioners about that. But just returning to the whole question of what is terrorism, there is clearly a danger here, and the government are kind of skating around it a bit, of defining everything that's horrible and that we don't like as terrorism. And the more you do that, the more the word itself loses its edge and its meaning. And if there is no ideology, and I think there is no sign of an ideology in this particular case, we don't really know what his own views are. You say information has tumbled out, Hannah, but in a sense, he is still this character, a complete mystery. We know that he came from a Christian background, his family of Christians. We know that he used had downloaded an Al-Qaeda handbook, which is in itself suggestive. But as to the rest of his actual motivations and the rest of his views, whether he is beyond anything more than a kind of very, very angry, disturbed young man, we don't know. So there's a lot we don't know here. But I think the problem with expanding the definition of terrorism is you then ask MI5 and the Met Police. I was talking to Neil Basu, the former Assistant Commissioner of the Met, who was in charge of counter-terrorism, and he would agree with, I think, everything that Jacob's been saying. The more you spread it, the harder it is to actually focus on what you can do in terms of networks. Frankly, if I'm sitting in my basement and I'm furious and radicalized and angry and I'm obsessed by violence and I'm not communicating with anybody else much, it is almost impossible to find me. I mean, that is the truth of it. And if we were going to, we'd have to, multiply the number of people working on this many, many times over, which is not going to happen. So there is a danger here of raising expectations that we can find every angry, distressed, dangerous loner in a basement around the country when candidly we can't.
I mean, we've one of our listeners, another Andrew actually, asked us whether Keir Starmer was only ordering a public inquiry, which is one of the things they've done, a non-statutory public inquiry into this because of Elon Musk's previous intervention. Now, I think that's a little unfair because actually behind the scenes, since last summer, and the Southport murders, the government has actually been doing quite a lot quietly because while it couldn't say more about the background to Axel Rudakubana. I mean, is that Do you think that's had any influence, Musk?
Not much. If the accusation is the government covered this up because they are frightened of the public understanding the truth about mass immigration and Islam, then it doesn't make any sense if the guy wasn't an Islamist in the first case. And so, as it were, the right has now pivoted to saying, well, if you hadn't covered it up, there wouldn't have been the riot because we'd all have known he wasn't an Islamist, which seems to me to be, putting it gently, fanciful. So, I don't think he's responding to Musk. He's responding to a kind of seething unease in the country about the truth of the matter and a willingness to believe there is a conspiracy, there is a cover-up, and everybody involved in government is part of it.
Jacob, I want to ask you about misogyny. And how we should view it, whether we should give it a greater focus, because it does seem likely that a hatred of women has played some role, potentially, in the Southport attack. The targets were young girls at a Taylor Swift-themed dance concert. There have been reports in the press this week from old classmates of his who said he didn't like women. We saw this again in the attack in Plymouth in 2022. The Manchester Arena bomber, Salman Abedi, showed a clear dislike and disrespect for women in the years leading up to that. I mean, I wonder, there have been calls that, misogyny should be brought in as a sort of ideology, or the incel ideology, the incel celibate within the terrorism bracket. I just wonder how we deal with it.
It's an interesting one, right? Of course, misogyny itself is a much broader phenomenon in society. It has its own significant harms outside of specifically extremism and terrorism, right? And I think there needs to be a broader conversation around what we do with that. Within extremism and terrorist movements, we consistently see misogyny and hatred of women as a cross-cutting phenomenon, right? So it might well be one of those, I think, what are technically called risk factors, which are identified when you might be spotting people early. But there is this other challenge, right, of what we would call extreme misogyny. The growth of ideologies which have a male supremacist angle, which see women as inferior, which are promoted by the like of Andrew Tate. There are a lot of concerns around this mounting in classrooms across the country, right? I think that in some cases, but not all, there is grounds to recognise a male supremacist worldview as an ideology in and of itself. But equally, it's important to recognise that it's a very important component in all of these ideologies and movements which we're seeing across the board, which we're already familiar with.
Going back to prevent, what do you think explains how, Andrew makes the point that obviously you can't pick up every loner sitting in their basement, particularly if they're not talking to anyone. But in this case in particular, Axel Rudakubana was referred 3 times and he wasn't then referred on to the Channel programme that you've mentioned. And actually, again, if you look at the data, I think it shows 7,000 referrals in the year up to the end of March 2024 again. Only 512 of those were adopted as a Channel case. Is it resources? Is there no mechanism that flags up, oh, hang on, we've had this guy before? What's...
Yeah, there's a few different things to unpack here. And, if we're getting into the rather dry discussion of policy, this is where the rub is, right? On the one hand, yes, the frontline services, which typically might pick up early warning signs that someone poses a threat, have been underfunded, right? As a result, there is less resource, less training available, ultimately less people as well, and less people with less time to make these referrals. I think there's also signs here of a clear lack of coordination between bodies. This is something which should be pursued further. But then we come back again, I think, to the fact that Prevent sits under our counter-terrorism strategy where there's an ideological component. Prevent is still pretty well-resourced, right? And there is statutory training for frontline practitioners, for teachers, for healthcare workers. So that is perhaps the most obvious area or the most obvious mechanism to put someone down. But this goes back to my first point. It's not necessarily the right one. What we would like to see is much more effective integration of safeguarding boards at a local level, both within the preventing architecture, but also potentially the establishment of new infrastructure as well to address with violence. And I think that this is really where the gap is. And I know that we've got inquiries coming down the line, but I would expect this to be one of the focal areas of that inquiry.
Andrew, we need a different kind of off-ramp, don't we, for schools that are concerned, rather than just channeling everyone through an anti-terrorism route.
I think that's absolutely right. But if you look at the problems with Prevent, I think it is. I mean, certainly people say that, too many of the people are very inexperienced still. There aren't enough people looking at the granular detail of all of this. That's not going to change, not with a government that's got no money to spend. I mean, let's be real about this. That's not going to change at all. You raise the question of misogyny. I think one of the really interesting aspects of this is if you can think of the two really aggressively polarized and opposite forces in the extremist world, the sort of al-Qaeda worldview and the extreme right-wing neo-Nazi veering on neo-Nazi and as it were, Western Andrew Tate worldview, where they would sit down together, join hands and agree warmly is about women. Women being the real problem. And in many cases, we are talking about men who have no prospects in this country, no chance of getting on in life. We keep reading that women are getting all, more and more of the better paid, what we used to call white-collar jobs, and are in despair generally, and they turn their attention, encouraged online, against women. Now, we come then to the other big question here is what can be done about a really toxic, really dangerous online world by, a medium-sized government like Britain's. And this becomes even more difficult now, of course, because we've got the tech bros hand in hand with the Trump administration, so they are almost the same thing. I mean, Elon Musk, X, Meta, Donald Trump, the White House, it's all one thing now. And so for Starmer or for the French and German governments or whoever to introduce more regulation, more quotes, censorship, close quotes, of the online world, rubs them straight up against Trump and brings issues of tariffs and economic growth more generally. That is the great dilemma that now faces Keir Starmer and his government.